This isn't B2B, business to business communications. This isn't really B2C, business to consumer communications. This is H to H. This is human to human. Before you write a word, think about the person you're trying to connect with. What effect do I want to have on them? Do I want to change their mind about something? Do I want to change their actions in some way? Do I just want their perception to shift slightly about a subject that I'm interested in? I think the most successful brands are just consciously, continually thinking, can we tighten this? Can we refine this? But it's at that moment that brands tend to go, there's something not quite right here.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Closer with Rob Self-Pierson. He is the founder of TBLS, the brand language studio, and the author of not one, not two, but 3 amazing books. Thank you so much for being here, Rob.
My pleasure, Michelle.
We're talking about the brand language studio. And could you just sort of walk me through why brand language is so important?
Maybe I'll start with, I suppose, what brand language really is. I think a lot of people don't realize that brands need to create language that represents who they are, what they stand for, how they communicate with people. So the brand language studio, I created it to create the language that brands use, to inspire the people behind that language, that writing. So a lot of companies have copywriters, but they also have marketing managers, and they have operational people who work in their teams as well. And everybody, every day within the world of work is using language. But I realized, and as I've developed my career, that very few people really think about the words that they use and the effect that those words have on other people. So the Brand Language Studio is there to support organizations in their language, to inspire them to be more considered in the way that they use language, to make deeper connections with the people who matter to them. That's what language does in the world of brand, but outside the world of brand as well. So my career has stretched through brand language, but also through travel writing. I write travel memoirs, I write short stories, I've written poetry. Language is my thing, and I'm always aware of the power that it has to not only change somebody's day, but change somebody's life sometimes as well. And brands are here with us through our lives. They're here every single day of our lives. When we pick up our phones, when we look at billboards, when we're on the train, when we're opening apps, brands are communicating with us. Yeah. And when they don't think deeply about the words that they use, they can push us away, they can offend us, they can upset us, they can have a detrimental, a negative effect on our day. So I'm here to try and make the experience that we have with brands through language as positive as we can possibly make it. And I have a small team of freelancers I work closely with, and that's what makes up the Brand Language Studio.
Were there any specific stories that you could share, like how brand language sort of shifts a company's brand, or shifts I'm not sure if it's just externally, is a brand just for external, or it could be internal as well, is it?
No, I think you have to believe, if you're going to go into a brand language project, that it affects everything. It affects every word that's produced inside and outside. And I think the brands that do it best understand that. The deeper I've got into my career, the more I've realized that culture within an organization can be totally transformed by the language that is used inside that organization. So an example that I would use, and it was probably it's still one of my favorite projects, and it was one of my first projects as a limited company. I'll tell you the story soon of where the Brand Language Studio came from. It came out of the ashes of another agency that I created. But that other agency, one of my first big clients was Gumtree, the online classified site. Yeah, I know. I was like that when I won it. I was like, wow, this is big.
Yeah.
I'd been a copywriter. I'd been a freelance copywriter, and I'd supported design agencies and brand agencies and advertising agencies just writing copy, so the language, the words that brands create. And then I decided that actually, I think one of the reasons for creating I'll come back to Gumtree in a second, but one of the reasons for creating a studio was that writers often don't get the credit that I think they deserve. In design agencies, branding agencies, the agency did the work. And I always wanted the writer to get a bit more recognition for it. So I thought I'll create a studio that represents me as a writer, and I'll bring other freelancers in, and we'll have a little bit more of a connection between the work that we do and the project that people see on the outside. So I created The Table, it was called. Before the Brand Language Studio, I was The Table. The idea was that I wanted to bring everybody to the table, as in the sort of the idiom, the saying, we'll bring you to the
Oh,
table.
I love that.
Bring ideas to the
Yeah.
table, bring people to the
I
table.
can see that now.
There was a trademark issue, which we'll come to, so I'm not the table anymore, but the table's first big client was Gumtree.
Wow.
It was a partnership with my agency, my studio, and a design studio. And I walked into the studio, the design studio, and they said, you need to sign a non-disclosure agreement because we'd like you to work on this project with us, and it's quite big. And I'd only really been a copywriter. I'd been writing copy for other agencies. And the guy who ran the studio said, right, it's Gumtree. Have you ever heard of them? And I said, yeah, I've definitely heard of them. He said, they need a new tone of voice. And I said, okay. And I'd never developed a tone of voice by myself before. So a tone of voice is the way that the words sound that come out of an organization. So you have the content itself, what you have to say to your customers or to your colleagues, and then the way you say it.
It's like the delivery aspect of
the sound of the words that you say, hence the tone bit of it. So Gumtree needed a new tone of voice because it was having some perception issues. People who used Gumtree, so for those who don't know Gumtree, it's an online classifieds website where you can buy and sell things, little things that you have or big things that you have. If you want to sell your bike, you can put it on Gumtree. At the time, there was no real competition for it, but it had a perception that and I think I'm okay to say this because it was the output of research at the time. But people who use Gumtree said it's a little bit of a flat brand experience.
Okay.
I don't sense a personality. And then when it comes to the transactional moment where I go and pick up the bike, if there's an issue and I try and get back to Gumtree again, I hit a bit of a brick wall. Like, there's no personal connection. I don't feel like I'm supported. So I dug deep into Gumtree. I spoke to the teams internally and I did research externally to get a sense of why this was happening.
Yeah.
And long story short, developed a tone of voice that was around being more sincere. So actually, the words you were using, mean them, absolutely mean them. Put your heart into what you're saying here. So sincerely yours was one of the tonal principles that I wanted them to use in future. To be bold, to actually take a position in the transaction where they could be more answerable to what was going on, and that would influence their language as well. They'd use, not to get too scientific, but they'd use more declarative statements, or they'd use more active sentences. They'd play more of a role in the communications themselves. And the one that actually, so back to your point about whether this is an external or an internal thing, I developed, and probably my favorite still 10 years later, tonal principle of refreshingly optimistic. So I encouraged Gumtree to start being more optimistic, positive about the relationships that were being built between the buyer and the seller of these things, and bring into the language that they were using a celebration of the fact that, I mean, this was the beginning of the era of recycling and upcycling. And so actually we're doing a great thing as Gumtree. We're creating a platform where not only humans connect, but they pass on things that they don't want anymore, and they get reuse. And that refreshingly optimistic actually became not just a tonal principle for their external communications, but I trained around with a colleague, maybe 400. Gumtree's bigger than anybody realizes. They think it's just a platform. They have offices, and those offices are full of people doing a lot of work. And I trained pretty much everybody at Gumtree in the new tone of voice. And what happened was, so I run workshops that train people and hopefully inspire people to take on the tone of voice that's being developed and start using it. And what came out of those workshops was an internal cultural transformation. I had people who came into workshops saying, I'd never thought about language in Gumtree or in brands or in business in this way before. I started talking about this isn't B2B, business to business communications. This isn't really B2C, business to consumer communications. This is H2H. This is human to human.
Wow.
And I said that once. I said it once during a workshop, and someone about 8 years later got in touch with me and said that changed the way that I thought about the work that I do, the studio that I created. I realised that moment, and it happened again 2 days ago, and I said that phrase human to human in a presentation, and the person in the room said, now I get it. Now I get why this is such an important thing to do. So, yeah, in answer to your question, I believe personally, and I'm sure others would counter this, but I believe that a brand language project should influence not only the external communications, the stuff that you and I see as we walk around and live our lives, the advertising, the direct comms, the marketing, etc., but actually it should become part of culture. And when it becomes part of culture, that external stuff is just second nature to the people inside, because they're living their brand experience. But what it happens is it makes people love the place that they work a little bit more. Because if your place of work is refreshingly optimistic and you go in every day at 8:30 or 9 o'clock and leave at 5 o'clock, and actually the meetings are better culturally, more people want to be involved in them, then it's a better life experience, and that feeds outwards into the world of your external communication.
I love that. Thank you so much, Rob. And also, for instance, I've built a business, for instance, or let's say X built a business, but then didn't really consider brand language as part of the, say, one of the most important things that they were doing when they were building purely because we weren't aware. And then eventually they reach a point in their business and their growth where they realize, oh, wait, I should have incorporated this much earlier. Is it too late to rebrand? And
Never.
what's the expected steps that someone could take to, or you usually do to help transform someone's brand language?
Another phrase I'm going to throw in here is verbal identity. So there's a lot of crossover. Everything that a brand puts into language that changes a perception of that brand is part of its verbal identity. So if you think of verbal identity as a partner to visual identity, so perhaps the sort of the lay consumer customer would think about things like a brand's logo, a brand's, I don't know, typography, maybe color schemes. They'd be able to say, oh, that brand looks different. Tate and Lyle Golden Syrup have just changed their logo on their packaging, and people are saying, oh, wow, they've just changed something that was 180 years old or something like that, and they've modernized it. People are very aware of that quite quickly. When it comes to language, it's a bit deeper within, but generally when I'm brought into a project, a brand language or verbal identity project, it's alongside a visual identity shift, so a visual rebrand as well. So the Gumtree project, they visually rebranded, and that's why the design agency thought at the same time as updating, modernizing, shifting our visual identity, we should work with a writer and a writing team to change the verbal identity at the same time. So generally, brands think about language when they think about the visuals. I've sort of lobbied for years to, not physically, but I've thought in my head and I've championed language to the extent that I want it to be seen at times as a standalone. So a business can go, we're not making connections with our consumers, or we're not representing who we truly are. We're better than this, or we're different to this. We want to be seen. We want the perception to be different. That is the time, regardless of whether you're looking at your visual identity, your logo, your typeface, your colors, etc., that's when you should be thinking about your language. Either you're not making the connections that you hope to with your audience, with your consumer group, your demographic, or you feel you're not being true to who you really are as an organization. And sometimes that comes years into an organization existing. Sometimes it comes 10s, 20s, 30s, decades of years into it. But it's at that moment that brands tend to go, there's something not quite right here. And it's either a verbal, so language, written language, or a visual thing. I don't think that it's ever too late. I think that the brands who do it well are consciously aware of the language that they use. Therefore, they start to see where it's not making the connections or it's not being true to what they really stand for. So, yeah, and I would encourage any brand to just be consciously aware of their language. And as you pointed out, it's sometimes just not thought about. It becomes a functional asset of a brand. Well, we have to write that piece of marketing. We have to make this announcement. We have to do these crisis comms. And they get thrown down the line, and somebody at the bottom goes, well, I'll do it then. And you get this rushed or not thoroughly thought through piece of writing, piece of communication. Doesn't represent the brand, isn't right for the audience. Sometimes it's those moments that actually show a brand that they need to make a change, but it's the brands who are consciously thinking, is what I'm writing here right for my audience? Is it going to make that human-to-human connection? Is it really going to celebrate the new product that we're launching or improve the experience of this thing that we produce for them? We want them to feel better, happier, smarter as a result of the service that we offer. Is our language supporting that? Therefore, is our brand supporting that? Sometimes it takes those big moments for a brand to realize, but I think the most successful brands are just consciously, continually thinking, can we tighten this? Can we refine this? Gumtree have actually been back in touch in the last month or so. So I developed that tone of voice in 2015, I think it was. We did a refresh of it in 2018. And I now know that they're shifting their position. They want to think about shifting their position in some way. So the role that they play in people's lives, they're thinking about what is that role and how might we refine it in a way. And is our language right for that? So I had an email from the new head of marketing a few weeks ago saying, just to let you know, we're looking at the tone of voice again to make sure that it's representing who we truly are and who we want to be connecting with. So no, it's never too late. I think it should be front of mind all the time.
I love that. And then if anyone were to need some service support with this, they could come to TBLS. And what are the service offerings that TBLS provides?
That bigger thinking piece, so that verbal identity piece is core, and that generally sits in with brand strategy, brand positioning. So for me, part of verbal identity is the language that sits at the very, very core of your brand. So people will be thinking mission, vision, values, beliefs, proposition, all that kind of big, inflated, abstract language that sits at the core of a brand. It's still language. It needs to be clear. It needs to be understandable. It needs to set the foundations that brand really wants to be setting. So we support with that. We create purpose statements and proposition statements and positioning lines. We're doing a lot of that at the moment because I think that my side of the branding industry is evolving and maturing, and more writers are being brought in at that fundamental stage to work alongside strategists who are developing brand strategy and saying, I've got an idea of where this brand needs to go, but I just can't put it into words. I need a writer. I need a writing team. I need help with articulation. So that's one of the fundamentals of what we do now. We help with articulation of language at the core of a brand. Once you nail that, once you get that, you can start to communicate it externally and internally. So that's when we develop tone of voice. So that tone of voice should represent that positioning language. So if you're going to have a refreshingly optimistic tonal principle, it needs to tie in with the strategy. If the strategy of the brand is nothing to do with trying to entertain and bring people together and build closer relationships, then the tonal principle is wrong, of course. So I would encourage brands to bring a writing team in from the very beginning and then see how that language evolves into the tone of voice. And then the tone of voice, of course, influences the copywriting itself, the copy that the brand produces. So we support less so, but we still support. I bring in freelance copywriters into my team generally to say, these are the foundations of brand A. This is the tone of voice of brand A. And now they need to launch this new product, and they're producing some direct mail. They're doing social posts. They're creating a promotional video. So they need a script. Dear copywriter, you've got all you need here. We need you now to start developing the copy for it. So my career was copywriting. I now sit slightly above the copywriter, directing the copy a little more. But as the Brand Language Studio, we offer copywriting to support those brands. And then the thing possibly that I love most that we do is the training and the workshops and the encouraging people face to face, now that COVID is pretty much a distant memory and we can do face to face again as we are here. I for probably 5 years before COVID was being invited to travel the world, really. I was in Australia running workshops. I was in Geneva running workshops. I don't have the calling of a teacher, but I love seeing the change that can happen in somebody in 4 hours, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, however long a workshop might last, where somebody comes into the room and they hear that their brand has in some way changed their language, their verbal identity, their brand language, their tone of voice, and head of finance needs to sit in a workshop about language, about the new approach that we'd like you to take, head of finance, to communicate, to represent our brand slightly differently. And I've had people come into these workshops and just sit there and freeze and say, I can't write. I'm not a writer. I hate writing. And I say, this isn't a grammar lesson. This isn't a punctuation lesson. This is playtime. This is your opportunity to take what we've developed for you, this new verbal identity, the way that the brand wants to be seen externally. Here are some tips that we've developed into the tone of voice guidance. Play with them. Here's an exercise. Okay, we're launching I sometimes create totally fanciful exercises out of the world of the brand itself. We're now trying to connect with people here to do this thing. You know the tonal principles of our language now. How do you make that connection? And people go, okay, I'm going to start writing. I go, no, don't write. Let's do an audience exercise first. Imagine the person you're trying to connect with. Who are they? Where are they from? How's their day been today? Are they stressed? Have they just fallen in love? Have they just fallen out of a boat? Like, what's going on? When are they receiving this piece of communication? Before you write a word, think about the person you're trying to connect with. What effect do I want to have on them? Do I want to change their mind about something? Do I want to change their actions in some way? Do I just want their perception to shift slightly about a subject that I'm interested in? So in my workshops, I'm encouraging people to think differently about the way they approach communications and writing. And that head of finance person, generally 9 times out of 10, comes up to me at the end of the workshop and says, that was so different to what I was expecting it to be. And I'm not confident enough to go and write a novel now, but at least I have the confidence to try something new, and I get it. I get why we're doing it. I understand why language is important, and I'm going to give it a go. And that's probably the most rewarding thing that we do at the Brand Language Studio, is just to give a little bit more confidence to people who are fearful of writing, who find it really exposing, often because they were told at school that they weren't very good at it. Their grammar was wrong, or their spelling was terrible, or their punctuation, and you would be amazed at how often that stops someone even trying it. It becomes the most intimidating thing in the world, and I find it so sad that that can happen when language has this ability to help us express all we are and all we want to be, and brands as well. And then you get somebody who's 50 or 60 years old who says, I don't want to do it. I feel uncomfortable about it. And they just turn back into the child who was told they couldn't do it or they weren't very good at it. So workshops, training, storytelling workshops, tone of voice workshops, anything to do with language, that's the other thing that we do. And as I say, I think probably the most fulfilling part of what we do.
I just need to say I'm really impressed by, the things that you're doing in your workshops, because I think when you initially mentioned workshop, what I thought about is sitting down, watching people do presentations. At least that's mainly the type of workshops that I usually attend. And then you're saying that there are these exercises that helps people come out of their shell, and you know, I personally find that really interesting, and thank you for sharing that. But just stepping out slightly now on a higher level of perspective, and I think we talked about this previously, how we were both sort of interested in, you know, personal development
Yeah.
and understanding more about the journey, if that makes sense. And if you could share a little bit about how you founded TBLS to how it is now. Has it always been, you know, smooth sailing, or how is it like?